So, quick show of hands. How many people are familiar with Fiddler on the Roof? Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof. Not on a roof, but on the roof. So, you're familiar with Reb Tevia's little song, If I Was a Rich Man. Da 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 da. Not going to sing all of it. My voice is still, it's about 90% right now, so it's still creaking and cracking a little bit. But the, you know, I think there's a scene in that play, in that movie, where Reb Tevye is, going back and forth with one of his future son-in-laws, and the son-in-law is talking about, well, wealth is this thing which God sends as a test, as a curse to the wealthy, and Reb Tevye's answer is, "May God spite me with it mightily." Um, I think for a lot of us that would be our answer in the midst of that too, if we're honest, of saying, we look at this and like the disciples in the story that we just heard from Jesus, they're surprised with what Jesus says, because I think for a lot of people we look at, well, this wealth itself, it must be, all in all, it must be a blessing from God. It must be that which this person is wealthy, so therefore they must be in a right relationship with God, right? And I know that there are churches that will talk about it that way, and you can take select pieces of the Bible and kind of move that direction, but if you look at the New Testament in particular, and the way Jesus talks about it in particular, it's always one of these things to where it's something that is a test, it's a challenge, it's something that is hard for people to deal with. It's that which can pull our attention away. I shared, for those who actually got to see it this week, I do a little preview of what the sermon's going to be about, and I share the one piece that I have our confirmands memorize. I grew up memorizing, get the Luther Small Catechism. I memorized the entire thing, and then I'm probably like most people, that the second I had done my recitation of it before the council, the next day I hit delete. And I had the privilege and the challenge when I went to seminary years later to have to rememorize this again, and I realized, well, there's some really good stuff in here. And so there's one that I really, that it's right at the very beginning. And so Luther talks about, well, what is, it talks about the first commandment. So start at the beginning, start with the first commandment. So the first commandment, you're to have no other God. So what does this mean? And this is what I have the confirmands memorize. It's real simple. It's 11 words. You're to fear, love, and trust God above all things. If you get that right, everything else falls into place. And there's a reason that every other commandment begins, we're to fear and love God so that. That's really kind of the foundation. That's really the root. But I think that's also the hardest piece. And there are lots of other things that we want to give our trust to in life. There are lots of other things that we're told, hey, trust in this. Either this will make you happy, or this will make you successful, or this will make you who you want to be. We have an entire advertising industry that's dedicated to telling us stories of what will make us who we want to be. And so in the midst of all those other stories, I come to you today with a story where this young man comes to Jesus and he kneels before him and he says to Jesus, and I'm paraphrasing this somewhat, he says to Jesus, Jesus, I see what you and your disciples have and I want it. What do I need to do to have what you and your disciples have? What do I need to do to have that? And Jesus' initial answer is something, very typical. So first he says, okay, well, why are you calling me good? No one's good but God alone. But you know the commandments. Don't kill. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't bear false witness. Honor your father and mother. And this young man says, I've done all these since I was youth. But there's still something missing. I see what I don't have. I see what you and your disciples have. I want it. I want this trust. I want this trust. I see how you're living. And I see that confidence that things are taken care of. And I want that. And I love the line in there. Jesus looks at him and he loves him. You don't see that very often in the gospel. And the gospels are very picky on how they word things. And so there is this moment where Jesus looks at him and he loves him. And have you ever loved someone enough to say something hard to him? If you If you know someone who's dealing with alcoholism, it's much easier to just let it go. And it really takes caring to speak up, even when you know it may not be heard. If you see someone who's dealing with a toxic relationship, and maybe they're a teenager, maybe they're an adult, and sometimes, they're going to dig in their heels and say, well, yeah, you just don't like them, but sometimes they need to know that, I'm here for you. I see what's going on, and I'm here for you. Jesus looks at him, and he loves him, and he says to him, you're lacking one thing. I'm going to get back to this story, but I'm going to tell another story first. So Mark Allen Powell is a Lutheran teacher. He tells a story of when the early monks were coming into the region of Gaul, which is in modern-day France. So at this point, in the region of Gaul, these early people who we now think of as the Frenchmen, well, they were barbarians. They were a bunch of warring tribes that went out every spring to, one tribe against the other. And so these early monks come in without a lot of optimism about their potential of spreading the gospel among this bunch of rowdy individuals. But to their great surprise, the gospel takes hold. And these Gaelic warriors, they begin to say, okay, let me be baptized. And at this point, they're out in the country, and so they're doing baptisms in the river. And so, but they noticed something funny. Every single time when they would baptize one of these Gaelic warriors, they would go down into the water, but they held their hand up above the water. And they're wondering what in the world's going on with this, but hey, the gospel's being spread. We're having success, and they figured it out the next spring. They realized that right hand was the sword hand. They were willing to commit everything to God except, we're not willing to change this. Everything's been baptized except that which I'm going to go out and kill my brother or sister. That's what I held up out of the waters. That's what I held back from God. That's what I said, God, I love you, but you can control everything but this. I think sometimes as a pastor, in the midst of our relationships with God, over 15 years, I've had people ask me, what do I need to do to have a deeper, a closer relationship with God? And so often we'll start with, okay, well, what's your prayer life like? And then I typically know the answer to this question. So are you coming to worship? Are you coming to, we talked about last week, worship being that place where we expect to meet God, where we expect God to somehow be present. Whether it's in the time where we gather together and preaching, whether it's our time together at the Word. And then the next thing I typically ask, even before I start talking about, well, do you have any time where you read Scripture or anything else like that? Typically the next question I ask is, okay, so what are you giving? In Matthew's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has this line that I think we normally get backwards. We normally think what Jesus says is, where your heart is, there your treasures will be. But it's actually just the opposite. What he says is, where your treasures are, there your heart will be. And in this story, he says to his disciples, place your riches in heaven, build up your riches there. And so I think part of that is, it is a spiritual practice. It is one of these things, I think it's one of the most strange things that we as Christians do. In our society, we're told to hold on, that you never have enough. You never have enough to retire on. You never have enough to live on. You never have enough. And has anybody else had the experience where your possessions begin to possess you? Where you spend so much time, you buy that new car that you've always wanted, and then you spend all your time trying to make sure it stays clean and make sure it stays maintained, and it becomes, or a new house, and it becomes that money pit where it begins to suck all your energy and all your time and everything else that you want to invest in it. And our possessions can become that. We can become defined by that which we own. We can become defined by that which we have set aside. We can become defined by all these things. And I think, in America, if there was something that we normally hold out of the water, it'd be our wallets. These are hard things to talk about, and I understand that it's one of these things to where, this is maybe going to be one of my least popular sermons over this year, and certainly over this kind of series where we're talking about these basic practices of what do we do. But I do believe this is a place where God can meet us. In our Lutheran way of understanding the what worship does, we understand that Christ is present in the midst of when we come together and when the word is proclaimed. We understand that Christ is present when we gather together around the table and we celebrate communion. And right in between those things is when we do our offering and we think that Christ has left the building. And it's hard. Again, I have I've had these conversations with God over the course of my life as well. When I was finishing up my time in the Army, and then when I first got my call to go into ministry, to go on this path that I've been on, I had a young son who was a year and a half old at that point, and again, it was that call of, okay, I'm supposed to go into ministry. That means I'm supposed to go into seminary. That means that I'm going to be without income for 4 years, and okay, I just have a newborn son. How does that work? And that whole piece of God's, that subtle question of, going back to that, we fear, love, and trust God above all things. Will you trust Him? And, I think that, in very simple ways, the things that we give, and whether it is to the church or whether it's to the poor or whether it's to any other ways, that act of letting go, it's an act of saying, you know what, God, I'm going to trust you. In the book of Micah, talks about, the people of Israel are complaining that God's not giving them that which they need. And same like we heard in Amos, well, you're building all these things and you're not living in this way. You're putting all your focus in on building your own household, your own estate, all these other things. And they were always told, hey, this is the practice. This is the way in which you demonstrate this trust. You say, you know what, I'm going to take, in the Old Testament, I'm going to take 10%, that first 10% of whatever that harvest is or whatever it is I make, I'm going to give it back to God. And I'm going to trust that God will provide enough for me. And in my life, God's proven trustworthy. God has proven trustworthy in all of these things. I think that sometimes that which gets in the way, the young man comes to Jesus. Going back to the story, the young man comes to Jesus and says to Jesus and his disciples, I see what you have. I see this life that you're living. I see this hope that you have for the future. You know that not only your life now, but your life beyond this life is in God's hands. You understand that, and you live in a way that shows that. What do I need to do to have that? What's getting in the way of that? Jesus sees for that young man what it is. And he goes away sad. Now, I don't think this is the end of that story. When Jesus sees somebody and he loves somebody, things happen. And yes, I know that you'll sometimes hear pastors talk about the saying with the eye of the needle, and they'll tell you this story about, it's a gate in Jerusalem. It's not. It's the eye of a needle. Camels don't pass through that, not on their own. What Jesus is saying is this is impossible for anybody other than God. And I do believe that, when we begin to make these choices, when we begin to try and say, God, I want to trust you, as the young man said, as the father says when Jesus comes down the mountain and sees his son suffering with epilepsy, have faith. I believe, help my unbelief. I believe that God does that. I believe that God is at work in the midst of these things, that it's not just us saying, hey, I'm making a choice to do this. I believe that this is God also helping us learn how to trust, learn how to let go. Learn how to put our trust in the right things. You know, whether it is our jobs, whether it is our positions, whether it's the power that we have, whether it's our families, whether it's all these, the good things that we have, they're all gifts from God, and they're all good things. But what becomes the problem is when we say these things that are good things, they're the central thing. When we say this which is a gift from God begins to take that place of God. And for me, that's why this act, we have all these spiritual practices, these marks of the disciple life we read at the end of the service every week, where we worship weekly, we pray daily, we read scripture, we build spiritual friendships, we do all these different things. And one of them is that we give to God and our neighbors in need. And that's part of that act of learning how to trust, of saying to God, I trust you. I'm trying to fear, love, and trust you above all things. And it's hard. There are times where we may walk away sad, where we may have that part in our own lives, in that conversation with God of saying, you know what, I'm willing to give everything to you except. This is what I'm holding out of the waters. And that may be the very thing that is impacting that relationship. That may be the very thing that is holding us back from that which we're seeking. We come to God and say, I want that which I see. I want that which is a part of us. And God gives us so many things to sustain us in the midst of our journey. He gives us other disciples to walk with us along the way. He gives us others to tell the story of faith. He comes and promises to meet us in so many different places, in so many different ways. And God does provide. When that question comes up to, okay, well, why do we do this? Because God is trustworthy. Why do we do this? Because I believe that, even in the midst of all the other things that go on, and all the other things that we have to do to balance the checkbook and to put away for the future and everything else like that, that ultimately I can't control the future. But I'm wanting to put my heart, my trust in the one who does. And yeah, it's hard sometimes. And yet, what more do I lack? And sometimes Jesus has to look at me and love me and say that which I'm holding up out of the water. And I thank God that Jesus cares enough to do exactly that. Thanks be to God. Amen.